The rather poignant image of a father's grief at Ground Zero on the 10th anniversary of the September 11th attacks. The Times is also reporting on moves by America to bring the Taliban in from the cold, so to speak, and to allow the Islamist network to open an embassy in Qatar.
Well, there's an icy reception for British Prime Minister David Cameron in the Moscow Times, which quotes a top Kremlin aide saying the UK's leader's visit to Russia is unlikely to reset the country's troubled relations.
The business pages of the Gulf News say that Germany may be getting ready to give up on Greece and is laying the ground for a default while ratcheting up the pressure on Athens to meet its fiscal targets.
$9 billion, that's how much Britain's banks may have to pay to comply with the Independent Commission on Banking's recommendations, including that their core operations be ring-fenced from the rest of their business.
The South China Morning Post says that most of the world's commercial ship owners are calling on the United Nations to set up an armed peacekeeping force to sweep the seas of pirates in the Indian Ocean and the Gulf of Aden.
And 1 point. That was all that stood between Wales and victory in their nail-biting Rugby World Cup opening match against the reigning world champions South Africa. Cracking rugby.
Cracking rugby.
Cracking.
Not such a cracking result, I don't think. But some may say. Anyway, who are we to say? Joining us now is Bundeep Rangar. He's the chairman of IndusView. I'm sure you have a view on the rugby. We'll get to that in just a moment. Of course, yesterday, all the television coverage, radio coverage, media coverage of 10 years on from 9/11, the occurrence of 9/11. Yet an interesting move by the United States now to back this Taliban embassy. It's almost the next stage now of diplomacy, isn't it?
It is, and it's also, I guess, in some ways, the next stage of healing, right? Because, I mean, I've got a lot of friends. I studied in New York. This was a very depressing time for a lot of people. But this move is a signal of the way Obama looks at the world, right? It's not enemy the opposition or demonizing the opposition, if you may. It's trying to find a way to provide a forum for expression of their viewpoint, and in some ways it makes it inclusive. And if you look at past examples of extremely violent groups and finding a political representation for them, I guess one comparison, maybe not the fairest one, but certainly Sinn Féin and IRA as an example of an extremely violence-oriented group having political representation through Sinn Féin, and then using that as a way to get a dialogue going. It's a classic play to get movements from the extreme of a political spectrum more to the center. And this is, I think, a clever plot, a calculated risk, but certainly one that I think has merit.
Do you think it's likely, though, to anger some of the people, so particularly some of the relatives that are involved in 9/11?
Absolutely. I mean, it's again, it goes down to the way you view the world. Is it good versus evil, or is this, a spectrum of viewpoints? And certainly nobody's anyway condoning what's happened there. But look at South Africa, right? Look at the Peace and Reconciliation Committee and what that did in terms of forgiving and then bringing into full what clearly were crimes against humanity. Now, this is a measure, a method to, again, find a way of forgiving the past, if you can, and not creating a cycle of violence that's infested the Middle East. And you can look at, the area around Israel and see how 2,000 years have just gone around with cycles of violence. And this is one way to kind of say, let's put a stop to it.
Oh, well, obviously keep a close eye on how that develops. This reset button, do you remember that image of Hillary Clinton passing the reset button over when she was in, I think she was in Russia. But there's no reset button when it comes to David Cameron this time around, apparently.
No, it's been icy. They haven't had a high-level dialogue between the two countries since about 2006, I guess, since the last time Tony Blair visited St. Petersburg. This is, of course, a chance to put things back on track. And the irony of it is, of course, that if you talk to your average Russian business person and English business people, there's a lot of affinity between the two countries, and clearly a lot of Russian investment in London and the UK, from broadsheets to football teams. But at the political level, given what you mentioned before, the assassination in the UK of a suspect from their eyes, and of course all the machinations around BP that you've seen in the last few years, that's where you've got a backdrop of potential misunderstanding and confusion due to different ways of governing. And I think the letter in the Times this weekend was quite poignant about saying, look, we've got to attack and address human rights issues more than anything else, because that's the basis. It's that fundamental basis of how you treat people, and not have the Sea of Yuko sitting in jail for many years with an unknown outcome because of a political dissent.
But I guess with the amount of heavy hitters in terms of from British business, you've got Bob Dudley, who is the chief executive of BP. You've got the chief executive of Shell, Peter Boza. The bottom line is it's economics, isn't it? They want the business, and human rights will take a second a backseat, won't it?
Unfortunately, you're right, and in some ways it's not dissimilar to what you see in terms of Western business interests in China. But having said that, there's a school of thought that says once you bring about economic reform, it creates the groundwork for creating political reform, and certainly a healthier dialogue will help address things about the human rights abuses or imprisonment of political dissenters. If it gets to a polarization, then you have no channels of communication in the first place. So there's two ways of looking at it. Either you sanction and just wait for an outcome, but that's a Cold War-like attitude, or you create the dialogue, open up business channels, and that leads to a method of solving some larger issues in human rights.
There's quite a correlation there between the Taliban and 9/11 and this as well, in some ways, on a different level.
It's going to be interesting to see how it's the chief executive of BP who's over there, how he's going to be in those meetings, because their offices have just been raided, haven't they? And they've lost out on that deal with to the US.
And he was the chief executive of BP TNK as well, so he's got a history of Moscow as well. But then that's a good thing, because he'll know the way it works.
We hope.
We hope.
It's interesting what's happening with the Eurozone at the moment, because Germany has been so vociferous about Athens having to sort itself out, stick to the fiscal targets that have been set. Yet it seems that these stories are creeping in to the press that Germany may abandon Greece. How credible is this idea?
Well, I think the political cost of bailing out Greece again after the big 10 billion bailout they had last year is just too high. And I believe that part of the press stories about maybe Germany abandoning them are coming from the fact that Greece has not got its house in order. Yes, they've talked about austerity measures. They've talked about, a salary-free 1 month period, kind of attempts to bring fiscal control. But at the end of the day, they haven't. And the cost of bailout is just too expensive politically more than anything else, because they can, from a financial perspective, find the funds, ring-fence the banks there, buffer their capital base to allow them to absorb this. But look at the battering that the banks have gotten in the stock market the last 2 weeks, whether it's German banks or French banks, and certainly British banks. And then the political cost of a leader having to make some very tough decisions, I just think this is too high. So I think there's actually certainly more than an iota of credibility behind that story.
It's almost political, isn't it? Because it looks like Angela Merkel's party is going to lose big time in the coming up elections as well. In fact, all the ministers that have been involved in the bailout, this time next year, none of them will be in power, probably.
Yeah, I mean
sweeping statement there.
It is a split. But you're absolutely right. It is politically motivated, and that's why I started off by saying it is an election issue more than anything else. This is too high a political cost for Merkel or Sarkozy or anybody else for that matter.
Just over an hour before the Vickers report is out, the Commission is out. Is this going to be good for British banking? Good for the retailer, I think, is what we're interested in.
Back to the world of banking. I guess the challenge in this thing is how do you ring fence and separate two sides of business, whether it's the casino investment banking side of the utility commercial banking, in a clean and neat fashion, because it's simply impossible, right? You can't. Do you define a foreign subsidiary of a UK subsidiary of a foreign company to be a small, medium-sized company, or is that a large company, and therefore which part of the ring fence does it sit on? And historically, if you look at the big bailout in the past, RBS was probably the one bank that did actually have an exposure because of their casino-like operations. Bradford and Bigley and the other similar banks or building societies certainly were not exposed due to erratic investment moves. It was a pure commercial banking side that became affected and therefore needed a bailout. So even in that situation, this ring fencing won't really work. What's really troubling about this, of course, is that the UK, which has a lot of its GDP from financial services, will suffer because capital moves fast and headquarters move fast. So there's no doubt in my mind that if it's too onerous and too strict, the likes of Barclays, which is not dissimilar to Deutsche Bank in terms of the overall asset base and business model, can easily move to Hong Kong or Dubai or Singapore, where they don't have to fear a political solution to a financial problem.
And of course, the banks will say that they've done reform in the last 3 years, and they are unrecognisable and they don't need this.
And David Cameron's certainly not going to want this to happen for the next election, to your point about election fallout.
Your sweeping statement may have some truth to it, I imagine. We've got to talk about Wales, because I just felt so sorry for the team, didn't you? Did you watch it?
I didn't watch it. I'm not the biggest fan of rugby, no, but I've also got friends who were talking about it. And what I find is it sort of echoes what happened in the World Cup between Germany and England, when there was no utilization of technology to just get a really fair outcome, which is possible in this day and age. And you can see the outcome there of a Coast goal being lost, and some people not being very happy.
Never mind. Never mind. There's always the next time. Russia versus the USA on Thursday. Matches today, more tomorrow. That's it for the moment, Bundeep. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll see you soon.